There are men and women who sail beyond the Emperor's light, carrying his warrant in one hand and a knife behind their back, and I have seen what they truly are. I watched Captain Hieronymus Vex eat a still beating human heart aboard his flagship, the Eternal Vendetta, while his navigator wept blood from her third eye and whispered that the warp tasted of copper and screaming children. They call themselves rogue traders, bearers of the ancient Warrants of Trade signed by the God Emperor himself in an age when terror still dreamed of hope. But I know the truth now. I know what hides behind those gilded charters and ceremonial seals. I know what they do in the dark between the stars where no one watches, where no inquisitor's gaze penetrates, where even the Astronomican's holy radiance fades to a guttering candle flame against an infinite void. My name was Confessor Matthias Kole, and I served the ecclesiarchy aboard the rogue trader vessel Chains of Dominion for 17 standard years before I understood that I was not witnessing the work of the Emperor's faithful servants, expanding his domain into the frontier darkness. I was documenting something far older and more terrible. The warrant itself, that sacred parchment I kissed each morning in the ship's chapel, bore the Emperor's own signature in ancient ink that still shimmered with a faint psychic resonance, but the document was stained. Not with age. With something else. The edges were brown with what the ship's lex mechanic identified as human blood, type AB negative, dating back 10,000 years to the Great Crusade itself. I asked the captain, Lord Trader Vakon Ma, why the Emperor's own signature sat in a frame of dried gore. He smiled at me with teeth filed to points and said the warrant was signed in the blood of those who refused to trade. Then he returned to eating his meal, which I later discovered was not reclaimed protein, but the rendered flesh of a mutineer who had questioned our destination. The Imperium tells its loyal subjects that rogue traders are heroes, pioneers pushing into the unknown to claim new worlds for mankind and the Golden Throne. They speak of these dynasty lords as extensions of Imperial will, sanctioned explorers bearing the Emperor's mandate to bargain, conquer, and colonize in his name. This is the story taught to children in Schola Progenium, recited by priests in cathedral halls, printed on propaganda leaflets dropped from orbital stations onto compliant worlds. It is a beautiful lie. The truth is that a warrant of trade is not merely permission to explore. It is a license to commit any act, any horror, any betrayal of human decency, and to do so under the protection of the Imperium itself. The holder of such a warrant is functionally above Imperial law in the regions beyond the Astronomican's reach. They answer to no one, not the Adeptus Arbits, not the Inquisition, not even, in practical terms, the High Lords of Terror themselves. They are sovereign unto themselves, little god emperors of their own domains, and the things they do with that freedom would make a daemon weep with envy. I learned this slowly, piece by piece, like assembling a mosaic made of broken glass and bone. At first I thought Lord Trader Ma was simply pragmatic, willing to bend the Imperium's more restrictive doctrines in service of the greater mission. When we traded with Xeno's merchants in the Halo Stars, I told myself it was necessary diplomacy. When we sold lasguns to a world that worshipped the Emperor as a six-armed god of lightning, I convinced myself we were spreading his influence, however distorted. When we loaded 3,000 indentured servants into cargo holds without life support, and I heard them screaming through the bulkheads for 2 days until the screaming stopped, I prayed for their souls and told myself that expansion required sacrifice. But then came the world-designated Tertius 9, and I could no longer lie to myself about what I was serving. Tertius 9 was a feudal world, its people living in stone castles and farming with wooden plows. Their technology regressed to almost pre-imperial levels after some ancient calamity had shattered their orbital infrastructure. They worshipped the Emperor as the Sky Father, a benevolent deity who watched them from the stars, and they were innocent in a way I had not seen since leaving my birth hive on Ophelia Visiri. When we arrived in orbit, Lord Trader Ma opened negotiations with their king, a decent man named Aldrich who wore a crown of iron and spoke High Gothic with a charming archaic accent. Aldrich offered us everything his world possessed: grain, timber, precious metals, even his own daughter's hand in marriage to cement the alliance. He begged us to bring his people into the Imperium proper, to reunite them with the wider galaxy, to teach them the Emperor's true word. Ma listened to all of this with the patience of a predator watching prey exhaust itself. Then he activated the Warrants override codes and ordered the world's subjugation. We did not conquer Tertius 9, we harvested it. Ma's contract was with a rogue trader named Severina Cross, whose dynasty specialized in supplying Adeptus Mechanicus forge worlds with biological material for servitor production. Tertius 9's population, untouched by generations of industrial pollution and remarkably genetically pure, represented a fortune in raw materials. Over the course of 3 months, Ma's troops rounded up every human being on that world. They sorted them by age, health, and genetic markers. The children went to the Mechanicus processing stations. The adults went to labor camps to extract every mineral and resource from the planet's crust. The elderly were rendered into nutrient paste for the ship's protein recyclers. King Aldrich himself was lobotomized and converted into a servitor, his crown welded to his skull, his royal hands replaced with industrial clamps. I watched Ma install him in the ship's waste reclamation bay, where the former king now spends eternity processing human excrement, his dead eyes staring at nothing while his slack jaw works in meaningless chewing motions. When I protested, when I invoked the Emperor's mercy and quoted scripture about the value of human souls, Ma showed me the warrant again. He pointed to a specific passage, written in High Gothic so ancient I could barely pass it, that explicitly granted the bearer authority to claim, conscript, convert, or consume any human resources encountered in the pursuit of imperial expansion. The Emperor himself had authorized this, 10,000 years ago. He had looked into the future and granted this permission. This nightmare was holy work. That realization broke something fundamental in my understanding of the Imperium. I had spent 30 years believing in a divine order, a sacred hierarchy that existed to protect humanity and guide it toward enlightenment. I had preached this faith to millions. I had baptized soldiers before they marched to die in the Emperor's name. I had burned heretics and felt righteous doing so. Now I understood that the entire structure was more complex and more terrible than any sermon had prepared me for. The Imperium was not a benevolent theocracy shepherding humanity toward salvation. It was a vast machine of survival, grinding forward through an uncaring universe, and the rogue traders were its outriders and its opportunists, empowered to do whatever necessary in the dark places where imperial authority became more suggestion than law. They were the ed of the Imperium made manifest, the ugly truths hidden behind the propaganda and the liturgies and the endless sermons about the Emperor's love. They were what we were, stripped of pretense. I should have died on Tertius 9. I should have refused to participate, should have called out to the Inquisition, should have martyred myself in glorious defiance. Instead, I survived by pretending ignorance, by continuing my priestly duties, by blessing the servitors that had once been children and praying over the nutrient paste that had once been grandmothers. I survived because I was a coward, and because some part of me wanted to see how deep the darkness went. I wanted to understand the true scope of what a warrant of trade permitted. I wanted to catalogue every horror, every exception, every secret that the Imperium's official histories glossed over or omitted entirely. I told myself I was bearing witness, that someone needed to document these crimes so they could never be denied. The truth was simpler. I had become fascinated by the abyss, and I could not look away. The other rogue traders I encountered during my years aboard the Chains of Dominion made Ma look almost restrained by comparison. At a gathering on the Void Station called Last Hope, I met a woman named Katerina Vrost, whose warrant had been in her family for 8,000 years, and who had used it to establish a personal empire spanning 14 worlds. Her flagship, the Undying Rose, was built around a dark age of technology device called a Genesis engine that could terraform entire planets in a matter of years. She used it to create custom-designed paradise worlds, which she then sold to the highest bidder. But the process required vast quantities of biomass to fuel the engine's reality-altering machinery. Vrost had solved this problem by designating certain Imperial frontier worlds as resource zones, and strip mining them of every living thing. I watched her data slate display images of once verdant worlds reduced to barren rock, their entire biospheres converted into genetic slurry and fed into her ship's central processor. She showed these images the way another noble might display paintings or sculptures, admiring her work with genuine aesthetic pleasure. When I asked how she reconciled this with the Emperor's command to cherish and protect humanity, she laughed and said the Emperor had conquered hundreds of worlds during the Great Crusade and killed billions doing so, and if it was righteous for him, then it was righteous for her. The warrant, she said, made her an extension of his will, and therefore anything she did was by definition holy. I could not argue with the logic, even though every word she spoke made my soul ache. Then there was Hadros Kane, a rogue trader who specialized in xenotech acquisition and who had converted his entire crew into albumin variants through controlled exposure to warp radiation and genetic manipulation. His ship, the Mutant Crown, was crewed by things that had once been human but now barely qualified for the term. I saw men with 3 arms and faces like melted wax. I saw women who communicated through subsonic vocalizations and whose eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence. I saw children born in the ship's depths who had never known gravity and whose bodies had elongated into something almost serpentine. Kane himself was a grotesque figure, his body augmented with dozens of Xenos implants that gave him inhuman strength and senses, but also marked him as something other than the Emperor's pure creation. He told me that his warrant specifically permitted the exploration and exploitation of alien technologies, and that modification of human biology was simply another form of technology. The Mechanicus priests aboard his ship blessed his mutations as holy evolution toward the Omnissiah's perfection. I watched them perform a prayer service over a new mutation cluster that had emerged in the lower decks, chanting the litany of the machine while people screamed as their bones broke and reformed into new configurations. The line between human and Xenos, between sacred and profane, had dissolved completely aboard the Mutant Crown, and everyone involved believed they were serving the Emperor's grand design. The nightmare deepened when I learned about the Red Market, a secret gathering held once every solar year in a nameless system, where rogue traders came to trade goods too dangerous or too forbidden for normal commerce. I attended once, brought by Lord Trader Mar as his confessor and witness, and I saw things there that I still cannot fully process. There were slave markets, of course, entire populations bought and sold in bulk, but that was almost mundane compared to the rest. I saw a rogue trader selling vials of distilled human suffering, psychic residue extracted from torture victims and packaged for use in warp rituals. I saw another offering genuine daemon-possessed artifacts that had been blessed by a corrupted priest and marketed as protection against the ruinous powers. I saw a woman demonstrating a device that could extract a person's memories and personality and transfer them into a data core, effectively granting immortality to anyone wealthy enough to afford the process. And the device's demonstration model was a screaming child whose consciousness was being carved out of its skull, one neural pathway at a time. Every transaction was legal. Every horror was sanctioned. The warrants made it so. The Emperor's own signature, duplicated across 100 different parchments held by 100 different dynasties, authorized every atrocity I witnessed that day. But the worst discovery came later, in the quiet hours of my cell, when I began researching the history of the Warrants of Trade themselves. The Imperium's official records stated that the Emperor had issued the first warrants during the Great Crusade as a practical necessity, empowering certain trusted individuals to operate independently in regions where direct Imperial control was impossible. This much was true. What the records did not mention, what I found buried in ancient data archives and fragmentary Lex Mechanic files, was why the Emperor had granted such absolute authority. The answer lay in a single, terrible phrase that appeared in the oldest versions of the warrant template, a phrase that had been edited out of later versions, but remained visible in the Archaeotech documents stored in the Chains of Dominion's forbidden library. The phrase read, "In the grim darkness of the far future, survival supersedes morality and necessity absolves all sins." The Emperor himself, at the very height of his power, had acknowledged that the Imperium's expansion would require acts that could not be justified by any traditional moral framework. He had created the rogue traders as a mechanism to perform those acts while maintaining the Imperium's official pretense of righteousness. They were the designated sinners, empowered to bear the moral weight of the Imperium's darkest necessities, so the rest of humanity could sleep soundly believing in a benevolent theocracy. This revelation destroyed whatever remained of my faith. I had believed the Emperor was divine, infallible, a God who embodied perfect justice and perfect mercy. Now I understood he was something more complex and more terrible, a being who had calculated the exact price of humanity's survival and decided it was worth paying regardless of the cost in suffering and blood. The rogue traders were not aberrations or corruptions of his vision. They were the vision laid bare, stripped of the comforting lies and noble rhetoric. They showed what the Imperium really was beneath all the prayer and propaganda: a desperate, violent, a moral machine clawing its way through a hostile universe by any means necessary, sanctifying its crimes with divine authority, and calling the result holy. I could no longer pretend otherwise. I could no longer stand before the Emperor's altar and preach his love while knowing the depths of pragmatic evil he had authorized in his own name. I began planning my escape from the chains of dominion shortly after the Red Market, but escape from a rogue trader vessel is nearly impossible. These ships are entire worlds unto themselves, void cities housing populations of tens of thousands, and every corridor is monitored, every access point guarded, every potential exit controlled by systems that have evolved over centuries of paranoid security. Lord Trader Mar's family had held their warrant for 6,000 years, and they had learned every trick of maintaining absolute authority over their domain. I was one confessor among a crew of 20,000 souls, and most of those souls belonged to Mar more completely than serfs belonged to their lords. They had been born on the ship. Their ancestors had served his ancestors. They knew no other life. When I tried to subtly probe for allies, for others who might question what we were doing, I found only hollow-eyed servants who repeated the ship's catechisms like mantras and seemed genuinely unable to conceive of any existence outside Mar's will. The rogue trader dynasty did not merely rule through force. It ruled through generations of indoctrination, so complete that rebellion was literally unthinkable to those raised within the system. My chance came during a warp transit gone wrong. We were traveling through a region known as the Screaming Gulf, a stretch of space where the barrier between real space and the Imperium grew dangerously thin. The ship's navigator, a woman named Esme Vortis who had served the Mar family for 2 centuries through Juvenat treatments and augmetic enhancements, began experiencing visions during the journey. I was called to her sanctum to provide spiritual counsel, and I found her strapped to her throne, her third eye weeping blood that steamed when it hit the deck, her mouth forming words in languages that predated humanity. She grabbed my hand with crushing strength and whispered, "The things we do echo in the warp forever, Confessor. Every murdered world, every harvested population, every moment of suffering we inflict, it's all there, recorded in the tides of the Imperium, and it's building towards something. The Emperor can see it. He sees it all from his throne, and he weeps, but he cannot stop it because he authorized it. He signed the warrants. He knew what we would become." Then her eye exploded in a shower of crystalline shards, and she started screaming a name over and over, a name I will not repeat here, because even writing it down might draw attention I cannot afford. The warp breach that followed nearly destroyed the ship. The Jello field collapsed in 3 sectors simultaneously, allowing the raw stuff of the Imperium to flood into our reality. I saw things during those hours that confirmed everything Navigator Vortis had said and worse. I saw daemons wearing the faces of people we had murdered, taunting us with our crimes. I saw visions of Tertius IX's children, their small forms writhing in servitor shells, calling out to the Emperor for salvation that would never come. I saw Lord Trader Mar as he truly was, not a human being but a construct of inherited guilt and multi-generational sin, a thing that had forgotten how to be anything other than a predator wearing human skin. And I saw the warrant itself, the physical parchment sealed in Mar's sanctum. and I saw that it was burning with cold black flames that gave off no heat, but filled the air with the smell of ash and myrrh. The Emperor's signature writhed like a living thing, and for just a moment I thought I could feel his presence, ancient and terrible and utterly inhuman, watching everything we did with eyes that contained no mercy, because mercy was a luxury the species could not afford. I fled during the chaos. The ship's security was entirely focused on containing the demonic incursion, and I managed to reach one of the auxiliary shuttlecraft and launch myself into the warp-touched void. I should have died instantly. A human alone in a small craft without a proper Gela field, surrounded by the raw energy of the Imperium, has no chance of survival. But something protected me. I cannot say what. Perhaps it was the Emperor himself, though I no longer know if his protection would be blessing or curse. Perhaps it was simple probability, one lucky soul slipping through the cracks in an uncaring universe. Perhaps it was something darker, some warp entity that saw use in preserving me as a witness to humanity's self-inflicted horrors. Whatever the reason, I survived. The shuttle drifted for 3 weeks before being picked up by an Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessel. I told them I was a survivor of a ship lost to warp storms, and they asked no questions. The Mechanicus cares little for human stories. That was 7 years ago. I am no longer Confessor Matthias Kole. That man died in the warp breach aboard the Chains of Dominion. I am something else now, something without name or purpose except to remember and to testify. I have spent these years traveling the Imperium's edges, moving from world to world, documenting what I can of the rogue traders' true operations. I have spoken with other survivors, other witnesses, other broken servants who escaped or were discarded by these dynasty lords. I have compiled records. I have stolen data slates. I have preserved evidence of crimes that the Imperium will never prosecute because the crimes are legal, sanctified by documents signed by the Emperor's own hand 10,000 years ago. I know now that I cannot stop this. I cannot reform it. The system is too vast, too ancient, too deeply woven into the Imperium's fundamental structure. The Warrants of Trade will endure as long as the Imperium itself endures, because they are one of the mechanisms that allows the Imperium to endure. But I can tell you what they are. I can strip away the propaganda and show you the truth. Rogue traders are not heroes. They are not pioneers. They are the Imperium's necessary evils, empowered to commit any atrocity in the name of expansion and survival, answerable to no authority except their own consciences, which have been systematically eroded by generations of absolute power and moral compromise. They are men and women who have looked into the abyss of what the Imperium requires and have become the abyss, all while carrying the Emperor's blessing and the Imperium's gratitude. They are what we might all become if given enough authority and enough distance from consequences. They are the dark mirror of Imperial ambition, showing us exactly how much evil a human being can commit while still technically serving humanity's survival. I met another rogue trader 3 years ago on a trading station orbiting a nameless ice world in the Segmentum Pacificus. His name was Corvin Blackwater, and his dynasty had held their warrant since before the Horus heresy, making them some of the oldest and most powerful traders in known space. Blackwater was conducting business with a group of elder corsairs, trading them weapons and intelligence about Imperial fleet movements in exchange for something called soul stones, crystalline matrices that contained the spirits of dead elder. I watched this exchange happen openly, in full view of the station's authorities, because Blackwater's warrant superseded every prohibition against Zeno's collaboration. When I asked him why he would arm humanity's enemies, he explained it to me with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow child. The elder are dying, he said. Their species is circling the drain of extinction, and they know it. These corsairs are desperate enough to trade anything for a chance to preserve their people's souls from she who thirsts. So I give them weapons that will keep them alive just long enough to acquire more resources, which they will trade to me for more weapons, which will keep them alive just long enough to acquire more resources. It is a beautiful cycle. They think they are buying survival. I am selling them a slower form of extinction, and in the meantime I profit, and the Imperium benefits from having these particular Xenos focused on their own preservation rather than raiding our worlds. Everyone wins except the Elder, and they are not truly winning even when they think they are. This is what the Warrant permits me to see, Confessor. The long game, the multi-generational strategy that no planetary governor or sector lord has the freedom or the vision to play. This is what the Emperor created us to do. That conversation revealed another dimension of the rogue traders' true role. They were not merely opportunists exploiting the edges of Imperial law. They were conducting long-term strategic operations that served the Imperium's interests in ways the hidebound bureaucracy of the Administratum could never achieve. Blackwater was weakening the Elder. Katarina Vrost was creating habitable worlds that would house humanity's expansion in future centuries. Hadros Kane was developing biological adaptations that might allow humanity to survive in hostile environments. Even Lord Trademar, with all his casual cruelty and his harvest of Tertius IX, had been providing the Mechanicus with resources it needed to maintain the Imperium's war machine. Every atrocity had a pragmatic justification. Every crime served a strategic purpose. The Emperor had not created the Warrants of Trade as a cynical exercise in authorized evil. He had created them as a necessary tool of species survival, and he had been correct to do so, and that correctness was more horrifying than any simple corruption could have been. I learned this more deeply when I encountered one of the legendary lost traders, rogue traders whose vessels had disappeared beyond the edges of known space and whose fates were unknown. His name was Erasmus Hale, and I found him on a forge world called Metallica where he was selling xenotech recovered from something he called the Ghost Sectors, regions of space so far beyond the Astronomican's reach that they appeared on no Imperial charts. Hale had been gone for 400 years. He had launched his expedition with a fleet of 12 ships and 10,000 crew members. He returned alone in a vessel that barely qualified as functional, its hull scarred by weapons that left wounds reality itself could not fully heal. He was the only survivor. He told me his story over the course of 3 days, and I recorded every word even though hearing it aged me in ways juvenile treatments will never reverse. Hale's expedition had discovered a region of space where human civilizations had existed during the dark age of technology and had survived through the age of strife without contact with either Imperium or the forces of chaos. These civilizations had evolved in isolation, developing technologies and social structures radically different from anything in Imperial space. Some were utopias, democratic societies without war or want, their populations living in peace through technologies that had solved every material need. Others were dystopias that made the Imperium look merciful by comparison, nightmare states ruled by artificial intelligences or genetic hierarchies or stranger things. Hale's mandate, as he understood it, was clear. He was to evaluate these civilizations and determine which ones could be integrated into the Imperium and which ones posed existential threats that required immediate elimination. He spent 2 centuries in the Ghost Sectors, and by the end of his mission he had destroyed 17 human civilizations, wiped out billions of people, and delivered the compliant ones to the Imperium's waiting arms where they would be broken down and rebuilt according to Imperial standard. The worst ones, Hale told me, were the peaceful ones, the utopias, because they had no defenses. They did not believe in war. They thought all conflicts could be resolved through dialogue and mutual understanding. When we arrived in their systems, they welcomed us with joy. They thought we were long-lost cousins returning from the stars. They showed us everything they had built, all their wonders, all their achievements, and they asked us to share what we had learned. I ordered planetary bombardment within 3 hours of first contact. I asked him why. He said, because they were an evolutionary dead end, in a universe containing chaos and the Xenos and the infinite malice of an uncaring cosmos. Pacifism is a luxury species cannot afford. If the Imperium had integrated them, their beliefs would have spread like a virus. Within a generation, Imperial Guard regiments would start questioning whether they should really be killing people. Within a century, the entire military structure would collapse under the weight of philosophical questioning. The Emperor understood this 10,000 years ago. Peace is a trap. War is the only reliable path to survival. So I killed them all, quickly and cleanly, before their ideas could contaminate the species. My warrant said I was authorized to do whatever necessary to secure humanity's future. I secured it by committing genocide 17 times over. Hale showed me his warrant during that conversation. It was one of the oldest I had ever seen. The parchment so ancient it was more dust than paper, held together by some dark age preservation technology that kept it intact against the ravages of time. The Emperor's signature was different on this one, rendered in a script that predated High Gothic, but it was unmistakably his. And at the bottom of the document, in tiny script that I needed an augmetic lens to read, was a single line that had been omitted from every other warrant I had seen. It read, "Bearer is absolved in advance of all crimes necessary to humanity's continuance, and shall answer for these crimes only when humanity no longer requires survival at any cost." The Emperor had known. He had looked ahead 10,000 years and seen what would be required, and he had pre-authorized it, and he had placed the only possible judgment criteria beyond any practical reach. As long as humanity was threatened, as long as survival remained uncertain, the rogue traders could do anything. They would only be held accountable for their crimes in some distant hypothetical future where humanity was so secure that it could afford the luxury of moral judgment. That future would never come. The Imperium's enemies were too numerous, too powerful, too eternal. The justification would last forever. I asked Hale if he felt guilt. He looked at me with eyes that had seen things beyond my comprehension and said, "Every moment of every day. I dream about the children I killed. I hear their voices. I remember their faces. But guilt is irrelevant. Guilt is a feeling, and feelings do not change mathematical realities. The Imperium needed those civilizations destroyed, so I destroyed them. If I had refused, someone else with a warrant would have eventually found them and done the same thing, or worse. The Imperium would have encountered them later under less controlled circumstances, and the resulting conflict would have cost even more lives. I optimized for minimum suffering. I acted with maximum efficiency. This is what the warrant demands. This is what the Emperor created us to be." He paused, and something almost like humor crossed his face. "Do you know what the real secret is, Confessor? The secret that even most rogue traders do not understand. The Emperor did not just give us permission to commit atrocities. He gave us permission to survive them psychologically. The warrant is not just a legal document. It is a spiritual absolution. It tells us that what we do is necessary, that we serve a higher purpose, that our crimes are sanctified by the species' need. Without that permission, without that absolution in advance, we would go mad. We would be crushed under the weight of what we have done. The warrant lets us sleep at night. It transforms murder into duty and genocide into service. The Emperor's greatest gift to us was not the freedom to act without consequence. It was the psychological framework that allows us to remain functional while acting without consequence. That insight broke something else in me. I had been thinking of the Warrants of Trade as legal documents, grants of authority with terrible implications. I had not understood that they were also psychological tools, mechanisms designed to prevent their bearers from being destroyed by their own consciences. The Emperor had engineered not just a system of authorized atrocity, but a system that protected the perpetrators from the mental consequences of what they did. He had created a framework that transformed moral injury into divine service, that recontextualized suffering as necessary sacrifice, that made peace with evil by declaring it holy. This was deeper and more sophisticated than simple corruption. This was social engineering on a metaphysical level, a deliberate restructuring of how certain humans experienced and processed morality. The rogue traders were not people who had overcome their consciences. They were people whose consciences had been rerouted, whose moral frameworks had been rebuilt around the central axiom that anything done in service of species survival was inherently justified. They were not monsters. They were humans who had been given permission to be monstrous, and a philosophical system that made the monstrosity feel like virtue. I spent 2 more years documenting this horror before I finally understood that documentation was pointless. No one would act on it. The Inquisition would not intervene because the Warrants of Trade were older than the Inquisition itself and operated in regions beyond inquisitorial jurisdiction. The ecclesiarchy would not condemn the traders because they carried the emperor's own signature and blessing. The administratum would not restrict them because the Imperium's expansion depended on their work. Every institution that might theoretically provide oversight was either powerless to act or benefited too much from the traders' activities to want to act. The system was perfect in its self-reinforcement. The crimes were legal, the criminals were heroes, the suffering was sanctified, and everyone involved genuinely believed they were serving humanity's highest good. I encountered one final rogue trader before I gave up my mission. Her name was Verity Throne, and she was different from the others in a way I initially could not identify. Her ship, the Absolute Conviction, was clean in a way that rogue trader vessels almost never were. Her crew seemed healthy and content. She did not trade in slaves or cenotech or forbidden technologies. She specialized in what she called cultural arbitrage, moving information and art and ideas between isolated human worlds and making profit from the exchange. When I asked her about the darker aspects of the Warrants of Trade, she did not deny them. Instead, she said, "I have the same legal authority as Ma or Vrost or Cain. I could harvest worlds. I could collaborate with Xenos. I could commit any atrocity they commit, and the warrant would protect me. I choose not to. The warrant grants permission, Confessor. It does not mandate cruelty. Most rogue traders forget this. They assume that because they can do anything, they must do anything. They mistake authorized evil for required evil. But the Emperor's signature on my warrant does not command me to be a monster. It simply gives me the freedom to choose what kind of person I will be without interference from Imperial bureaucracy. I choose to be better than the warrant allows. I choose to prove that you can serve the Imperium's expansion without becoming a demon yourself." I wanted to believe her. I wanted desperately to believe that the system contained the possibility of redemption, that not all rogue traders embraced the darkness, that the warrants could be used for something other than horror. But then I investigated Throne's operations more deeply, and I discovered the truth. She was not better than the others. She was worse, because she was more subtle. Her cultural arbitrage consisted of identifying worlds with strong indigenous identities, introducing them to Imperial culture in ways that made the local traditions seem primitive by comparison, and then watching as those worlds voluntarily requested integration into the Imperium to access the superior technologies and ideas she had shown them. She destroyed civilizations without firing a shot. She committed cultural genocide while maintaining perfect moral cleanliness. By the time she left a world, its people had abandoned their own heritage and begged to be colonized, and she collected her fees from the administratum for bringing new compliant worlds into the Imperial fold. When I confronted her with this, she smiled and said, "At least they are alive, Confessor. At least they chose their own subjugation. Is that not better than being harvested or enslaved or simply exterminated? I offer the velvet glove where others use the iron fist. The outcome is the same, but the process is more humane. This is the best the Imperium can offer. This is as good as it gets." She was right. That was the most terrible thing. In the moral landscape of the Imperium, in the reality of what the Warrants of Trade permitted, Verity Throne was genuinely one of the better examples. She proved that the best possible outcome, the most humane possible result, was still a form of slow destruction. The warrant granted so much authority, created such vast asymmetries of power, that even its most ethical users were fundamentally incapable of interacting with other humans as equals. Every encounter became a transaction weighted in the trader's favor. Every negotiation was fundamentally coercive because one party held the Emperor's unlimited mandate and the other held nothing. The structure itself was corrupt, and no amount of individual virtue could redeem it. I stopped documenting after my encounter with Throne. I realized that I had been approaching this wrong, trying to expose individual crimes when the real crime was systemic and entirely legal. The Warrants of Trade were functioning exactly as designed. The Emperor had created them to solve a specific problem. How do you expand an empire across a galaxy where communication takes years? Where authority cannot be centralized, where local commanders need the freedom to make irreversible decisions without waiting for approval from Terra. You grant certain individuals absolute authority and accept that they will use it in ways that range from pragmatic to monstrous. You build abuse into the system as a feature rather than a bug. You sanctify it with divine mandate so that no one can question it without questioning the Emperor himself. This is not a conspiracy. This is not corruption that has infected a pure system. This is the system working exactly as the Emperor intended, and he knew what he was doing. And that knowledge is more terrifying than any amount of ignorance or mistake could ever be. I have spent the last 3 years simply existing, drifting from world to world, no longer trying to document or expose or change anything. I work whatever jobs I can find that do not require deep identity verification. I have been a loading dock worker on a forge world, a scribe in an administratum office on a shrine world, a bartender in a void station's lower levels where the desperate and the damned drink themselves into forgetting. I am invisible now in the way that only the truly broken can be invisible, just another faceless servant in an empire of quintillions where individual lives mean nothing. And from this position of absolute insignificance, I have seen patterns that I missed when I thought I mattered, when I thought my witness and my documentation could make a difference. The rogue traders are everywhere. Not physically, but their influence permeates every level of Imperial society in ways I had never recognized. That forge world where I loaded cargo, half of its raw materials came from worlds harvested by traders like Ma. The Shrine World's administratum office. It processed immigration requests from populations displaced by trader activities, and the officials spoke about these refugees with casual contempt, calling them trader-touched, as though contact with a rogue trader dynasty somehow tainted them spiritually. The Void Station Bart. It was owned by a former rogue trader who had retired after 3 centuries of service and bought the station with wealth extracted from a dozen gutted civilizations. He was considered respectable. Pilgrims prayed in the small chapel he had funded. Local authorities deferred to him. His crimes had been laundered into legitimacy through time and distance, and the simple fact that he had operated under the Emperor's warrant, which made everything he did technically holy even if it was functionally monstrous. The Imperium does not just tolerate the rogue traders. It needs them. It has structured its entire expansion strategy around their existence. The Administratum's projections for new colony worlds assume a certain percentage will be discovered and prepared by trader activities. The Adeptus Mechanicus's supply chains for servitor components and exotic materials depend heavily on trader-sourced resources. The Imperial Guard's recruitment numbers factor in populations displaced by trader operations and desperate enough to volunteer for military service as an escape. Even the Ecclesiarchy benefits, sending missionaries along with trader expeditions to convert newly discovered human populations before those populations have any chance to negotiate their relationship with the Imperium. The entire machine requires the traders to function as they do, immoral and unaccountable, operating beyond the reach of normal Imperial law so they can do the dirty work that the official bureaucracy cannot afford to be associated with directly. I discovered this most clearly when I encountered an administratum official named Proctor Jervis, who had spent 40 years coordinating logistics between the Imperium proper and the rogue trader fleets. He was dying of some wasting disease that the local medica could not treat, and he had come to the bar where I worked to drink away his final months. One night, deep in his cups, he explained the whole system to me with the casual frankness of a man who knows he will never face consequences. The High Lords of Terror understand exactly what the traders are, he said, his voice slurred but his mind still sharp beneath the alcohol fog. They are a release valve. The Imperium has rules, you see, thousands of them, millions. Every action regulated, every deviation from doctrine noted and punished. But expansion cannot happen within those rules. Discovery cannot happen. Innovation cannot happen. So we created a class of people who are explicitly outside the rules, and we give them the Emperor's own blessing to do whatever they must, and then we pretend to be shocked when they do horrible things. It is theater. It is institutional hypocrisy on a galactic scale. The Administratum knows, the Inquisition knows, the High Lords know, even the Emperor knows, if he is still conscious on that cursed throne. We are all complicit. The entire Imperium is complicit. The traders are not aberrations. They are us, stripped of pretense. Jarvis died 3 weeks after that conversation, and I performed an impromptu funeral service for him because no one else would. I said prayers I no longer believed over a man who had spent his life facilitating atrocities, and I realized that I had become exactly what Jervis had been. Another cog in the machine, another person who knew the truth and continued participating anyway, because there was no alternative. You cannot leave the Imperium. You cannot reform it from within. You can only exist inside it, bearing witness to its endless cruelties, knowing that your witness changes nothing. The traders will continue their work. The Imperium will continue expanding. The suffering will continue compounding. And all of it will be legal, sanctified, necessary, and utterly without redemption. I have heard rumors that some traders eventually go rogue in a different sense, that they stop serving the Imperium even nominally, and become something else entirely. There are stories of dynasty lords who disappeared into the halo stars and the gold stars and the ghost sectors and never returned, who established their own pocket empires beyond all imperial authority, who may have fallen to chaos or achieved some other transformation that puts them beyond human classification. I do not know if these stories are true. I do know that if I were a rogue trader, if I had spent centuries operating beyond all moral restraint, watching my humanity erode under the weight of absolute power and authorized evil, I might eventually decide that serving the Imperium was merely another form of slavery. I might decide that if I am already damned, if I have already committed every sin the human mind can conceive, then I might as well be damned on my own terms rather than the Emperor's. The warrant grants freedom from external law. Perhaps some traders take the next logical step and free themselves from internal law as well, becoming something that transcends morality entirely, neither good nor evil but simply sovereign in a way that even the Emperor never was. That possibility terrifies me more than anything else I have discovered. The idea that the Warrants of Trade might not just authorize atrocity, but might actively transform their bearers into something post-human, something that has evolved beyond the constraints of human ethics and human psychology. I think about Erasmus Hale, who had spent 400 years killing civilizations and had developed a philosophical framework that made peace with genocide. I think about Katharina Vrost, who looked at images of dead worlds with aesthetic appreciation. I think about Hadros Kane, who had physically mutated himself into something inhuman. Were these people still human in any meaningful sense? Or had the warrant, the authority, the absolute power and absolute freedom, transformed them into something else? The Imperium categorizes mutation as corruption, as deviation from the Emperor's pure template. But what about moral mutation? What about psychological evolution driven by unlimited authority? What happens to a human being when you remove every external constraint and every internal inhibition and tell them that anything they do is sanctified by divine mandate? I have no answer to that question. I am not sure anyone does. The rogue traders are an experiment in applied theology and practical ethics, an investigation into what happens when you give mortals the authority of gods and tell them that their actions cannot be judged by any standard except species survival. The experiment has been running for 10,000 years, and the results are not encouraging. Some traders, like Verity Throne, find ways to remain marginally humane. Others, like Lord Trader Ma, embrace cruelty as efficiency. Still others, like Erasmus Hale, transcend conventional morality entirely and operate according to alien logic that may serve the Imperium's interests, but bears no resemblance to human values. And somewhere beyond the edge of known space, there are almost certainly traders who have gone even further, who have become something that the Imperium would classify as xenos or daemon or abomination if it encountered them without the context of their warrants. The darkest secret of the rogue traders is not that they commit atrocities. The Imperium commits atrocities every day. The darkest secret is that the atrocities are working. The Imperium is expanding slowly but measurably into regions that would otherwise remain forever beyond its reach. New forge worlds come online every year, fed by resources that traders harvested from unlucky civilizations. New colony worlds are settled by populations displaced or recruited or conquered by trader operations. New technologies enter Imperial service through traders who are willing to deal with xenos or excavate xenotech or experiment with forbidden sciences. The system is producing results. Humanity is surviving, and perhaps even prevailing in some small measure, because of what the traders do. If you measure success purely in terms of species continuity, then the Warrants of Trade are among the Imperium's most successful institutions. They are cost-effective, adaptable, self-funding, and virtually impossible to corrupt because they operate beyond any meaningful definition of corruption. They are already as bad as they can possibly be, and that badness serves a purpose. This is what I cannot reconcile. This is what has destroyed my ability to function as a moral being. I know the traders are evil. I have seen their works. I have documented their crimes. I have met their victims and heard their justifications. They are doing terrible things to innocent people, and they are doing so with the Emperor's blessing and the Imperium's gratitude. But they are also accomplishing their mission. They are expanding the Imperium's reach. They are securing resources and territory and population that the Imperium will need in its endless wars against Chaos and the Xenos and the Void itself. In a purely utilitarian calculus, in the brutal mathematics of galactic-scale survival, the traders' activities are justified. The suffering they inflict is less than the suffering that would occur if the Imperium fell to its enemies. The atrocities they commit are smaller than the atrocities that would consume all of humanity if the species lost its struggle for existence. The Emperor, with his infinite wisdom and his 10,000 years of contemplating humanity's fate, understood this. He knew that survival would require sins, and he authorized those sins in advance, and he was probably correct to do so. That correctness is unbearable. I cannot live with it. I cannot accept a universe where the torture of children and the harvest of innocence and the genocide of peaceful civilizations is mathematically justified by the requirements of species survival. I cannot worship an emperor who sanctified such evil even if his reasons were sound. I cannot participate in an imperium that structurally requires atrocity and then transforms that requirement into religious doctrine. But I also cannot escape. There is nowhere to go. The Imperium spans the galaxy. The Emperor's authority, as expressed through instruments like the Warrants of Trade, reaches into every corner of human space. You can flee from one world to another, from one sector to another, but you remain within the machine. You remain complicit. Your labor, your taxes, your existence itself contributes to the system that empowers the traders and sanctifies their works. There is no ethical position except death, and even death is not truly escape, because your recycled protein will feed the machine, and your soul will enter the warp, where the Emperor may still claim it for his endless war. I have begun to understand why some people choose chaos. Not because they believe in the ruinous powers, or because they find the daemon's promises appealing, but simply because chaos represents rejection of the Imperium's totalizing claim on human existence. The chaos cultists I met in the lower levels of the Void Station were not ideologues or true believers. They were people who had seen too much of the Imperium's inner workings and had decided that if damnation was inevitable, they would choose their own damnation, rather than accept the one the Emperor assigned them. They were making a choice in a system designed to eliminate all meaningful choice. I do not agree with them, I cannot follow them, but I understand them in ways that would get me executed as a heretic if I ever voiced these thoughts to an inquisitor. The line between faith and apostasy is thinner than the ecclesiarchy admits, and it grows thinner every time you look closely at how the Imperium actually functions behind its propaganda and its prayers. The rogue traders exposed this reality to me. They showed me that the Imperium is not a benevolent theocracy shepherding humanity towards salvation, but a desperate survival mechanism that has sacralized every tool of its own continuance regardless of the moral cost. They showed me that the Emperor's love, as preached from 10 million pulpits across 10 million worlds, is inseparable from the Emperor's calculated willingness to authorize unlimited suffering if that suffering serves humanity's statistical survival. They showed me that I have been serving not a god but a system, and that the system is functional precisely because it has long since abandoned any pretense of being good. It is merely necessary. Necessity has replaced morality as the Imperium's governing principle, and the Warrants of Trade are the purest expression of that replacement. They say, here is permission to do anything, to become anything, to sacrifice anything, because the alternative is extinction, and extinction is the only unforgivable sin. I am writing this testimony in a hired room on a hive world whose name I will not record. Tomorrow I will move to another world and then another, and I will continue moving until I die, or until the Inquisition finds me, or until some trader's operation sweeps through whatever world I am on and consumes me as it has consumed so many others. I have no plan, I have no mission. I am simply a witness, a consciousness that has seen too much and cannot unsee it, drifting through an empire that would classify this knowledge as heresy and my testimony as sedition. I am writing this not because I think anyone will act on it, not because I believe it will change anything, but because I need to establish that someone knew, someone saw, someone understood what the rogue traders truly are and what their existence implies about the Imperium and the Emperor and humanity's chosen path through the dark millennium. The rogue traders are not the disease, they are the symptom. They reveal the truth that the Imperium has built its survival strategy on a foundation of sanctified atrocity, that it requires men and women willing to commit any evil in the name of species continuance, and that it has developed theological and legal structures to make peace with this requirement. They are the Imperium without its mask, humanity without its comforting lies, the Emperor's will expressed with perfect clarity and perfect horror. They are what we are. They are what we have chosen to become in order to survive. And if they are evil, then so are we, all of us. Every human who participates in the Imperium's continuation and benefits from the suffering they inflict in our name. There is a passage in the oldest versions of the Imperial Creed, a prayer that has been edited out of modern liturgies but still exists in fragmentary form in certain archaic texts. It reads, Emperor of mankind, we come before you bearing sins we did not choose but accepted as necessary. Judge us not by the purity of our deeds but by the necessity of our survival. Grant us absolution, not because we are righteous, but because the alternative is extinction. Let our crimes be forgiven because they were committed in your name and for your species. This is all we can offer. This is all we have. Our sin is our service. Our damnation is our duty. I think this prayer was written for the rogue traders, or perhaps for all of us who participate in the Imperium's continuation, while knowing what it requires. It is the prayer of those who have seen the abyss and continued serving anyway, because there is no alternative except the void. I no longer pray. I no longer believe the Emperor can hear prayers, or that he would care about them if he could. The man who sat on the golden throne 10,000 years ago may have been divine, but if he was, then divinity is compatible with calculations so cold they would freeze a daemon's blood. He looked ahead across 10 millennia and authorized everything the traders would do, every harvest, every atrocity, every slow destruction of human dignity and innocence. He signed those warrants knowing exactly what they would permit. If that is divine wisdom, then divinity is simply a word for perfect pragmatism, and worship is just another name for submission to necessity. I cannot worship necessity. I can only endure it. The last rogue trader I encountered before I gave up my documentation entirely was a man named Solomon Geist, whose dynasty was so old that their warrant predated the Imperium itself, dating back to the unification wars on Terra before the Emperor even began his conquest of the solar system. Geist showed me the warrant with pride, pointing out that it bore not the Emperor's formal title but simply his name, written in a language that no longer existed. This is the first one, Geist said. This is the template from which all others derive. My ancestor was a warlord who controlled half of what remained of old Albia, and the emperor needed him to surrender peacefully so he could focus on the Frank-Iberian resistance. So he made a deal. He granted my ancestor authority to rule as he wished, to expand his territory without interference, to do whatever necessary to secure his power, in exchange for nominal submission to the emperor's ultimate authority. Every warrant of trade that has ever been issued is a copy of this deal. The emperor was willing to authorize anything, any crime, any horror, if it meant avoiding a conflict that would cost him resources. That calculation has been the basis of imperial policy for 10,000 years. The Imperium runs on deals like this, on compromises with necessary evils, on pragmatic alliances with people who should be enemies. My warrant is simply the oldest and most honest expression of that truth. Geist invited me to dinner aboard his flagship, a vessel called the Last Negotiation that was even older than his warrant, its hull bearing scars from weapons that had existed before the Age of Strife. The meal was served on plates made from gold extracted from a world whose population Geist had sold to the Adeptus Mechanicus for servitor conversion. The wine came from vineyards planted on soil enriched with the ashes of a civilization that had refused to trade. Every element of the dinner was a monument to suffering transformed into luxury, and Geist discussed it all with the casual pride of a collector showing off his acquisitions. He was not cruel in the way Ma had been cruel. He was simply beyond the categories of cruel or kind, operating according to logic so alien that ordinary moral language could not describe it. When I asked him if he felt any responsibility for what he had done, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "Responsibility to whom? The dead. They are beyond caring. The Emperor, he authorized all of this. The Imperium, it benefits from my work myself. I am fulfilling my purpose exactly as designed. There is no framework of responsibility that applies to me, Confessor. The warrant removed me from that framework 10,000 years before I was born. I am sovereign. I am accountable only to necessity and profit, and I have served both faithfully." That conversation was my last attempt to find some human connection to the traders, some point of moral contact where understanding might be possible. I failed. Geist was not reachable. He had been shaped by the warrant and by generations of absolute authority into something that no longer meaningfully overlapped with ordinary human moral experience. He was functionally alien, and the worst part was that he was correct about his position. The warrant did place him beyond normal frameworks of responsibility. The Emperor had created a class of humans who were legally, morally, and practically separate from the rest of the species, who existed in a different ethical universe where the rules that bound everyone else simply did not apply. This separation was structural and permanent. It could not be overcome by appealing to shared humanity, because the warrant had effectively created a new subspecies of human whose nature was defined by its exemption from human limitations. I left Geist's ship that night and never returned. I erased my documentation, destroyed my records, abandoned my mission. I accepted that the rogue traders were unsolvable, that they represented a problem without solution, because they were not actually a problem from the Imperium's perspective. They were a feature functioning as designed, and no amount of moral outrage or documentary evidence would change that basic reality. The Imperium needed them. The Imperium had structured itself around their existence. Any attempt to reform or restrain them would require restructuring the entire apparatus of imperial expansion, and that restructuring would cost more in the short term than the Imperium could afford. The system would persist because change was more expensive than continuance, and because everyone involved had too much invested in the current arrangement to risk fundamental transformation. So I stopped trying to change anything. I stopped documenting. I stopped witnessing in any official sense. I simply exist now, moving through the Imperium's lower levels, watching the machine grind forward, knowing what I know and bearing it silently, because there is nothing else I can do. Sometimes I encounter people who have been touched by rogue trader operations. I see the refugees and the displaced and the broken survivors. I hear their stories. I offer what comfort I can, which is never enough and never meaningful. I have become a repository for suffering, a living archive of pain that serves no purpose except to exist. Perhaps that is all any of us can be in the end. Perhaps witness itself is the only act of resistance available to those who see the machine clearly but lack the power to stop it. The rogue traders sail on, bearing the Emperor's warrant and the Imperium's gratitude. They harvest worlds and trade with Xenos and commit atrocities that would make daemons weep if daemons were capable of weeping. They do this legally, morally within their own framework, effectively beyond any consequence or judgment. They are the Imperium's necessary evil, its designated sinners, its sovereign agents of pragmatic horror. They are what the Emperor created them to be. They are what humanity has decided to become in order to survive, and they will continue their work until either the Imperium falls or humanity evolves beyond the need for survival at any cost. And neither of those outcomes seems remotely likely in any timeline that matters to the living. This is what I know. This is what I have seen. This is the truth about the Warrants of Trade and those who bear them. I have written it down not because I expect anything to come of it, but because someone should know. Because the dead deserve to be remembered, even if only by one broken man in a hired room on a nameless hive world. The traders will never answer for what they have done. The Emperor will never be held accountable for authorizing them. The Imperium will never acknowledge that its expansion is built on mountains of corpses and oceans of suffering. But I will remember. I will carry this knowledge until I die, and perhaps in some future so distant it might as well be fantasy. Someone will find these words and understand what we were, and what we chose, and what price we paid for survival in the grim darkness of the far future. In that darkness, there is more than war, there is also compromise, there is calculation. There is the cold mathematics of species survival that reduces individual lives to numbers in an equation too vast for any single mind to comprehend. The rogue traders are priests of that mathematics, faithful servants of necessity, true believers in the doctrine that anything can be justified if the alternative is extinction. They are the Imperium's darkest secret, not because what they do is hidden, but because what they reveal is unbearable, that we are all complicit, all participants in a system that requires horror and sanctifies it with divine authority. We are all traders in human suffering, some of us holding warrants that make it official and others simply accepting the benefits while pretending innocence. The only difference is honesty. The traders are honest about what they are. The rest of us are not. That is the darkest secret of all.